Welcome back to Prepare Them for Launch. In this episode, we are going to be talking with Jenn Griffin, who is an amazing mom. She's an amazing woman, and she is just a great all-around friend and person. She's going to be sharing her story through single momhood with us, both in her family of origin and in her own family as well. So we are so excited, Jenn, to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So Jenn, tell us a little bit about your story, who you are, and what brought you to this point.
Okay. So I am a mom. I have 4 adult children. 3 of them are married. I have 3 grandchildren. I grew up in the church, but then had a whole, like my parents got divorced when I was 13, and there was a whole lot of stuff. I've been married twice. I've been divorced twice. I am currently married to an amazing man who loves God with all of his heart and loves me. I've been at the church for, I want to say since like 2012, and my journey to get here was a lot, but God has been super gracious and faithful, and I kind of came back into, I grew up in a Christian home, walked away for a while, and then came back. And so there's like a lot that's happened from there that's been really good, but really hard as well. So
Yeah.
It sounds like there's been a lot of ebbs and flows. There's been some roller coaster happening, ups and downs with both the church, your relationship with God, and with people, which is okay. I know that's something that's very tough. And so it sounds like it's something that like you've had to kind of figure out as you were going through that. And I've seen, a lot of people have seen that happen in their lives. Yeah. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about like the specifics of your story of like how these things came to be, how the church came around you, how you felt in the midst of that, and how your relationship with God was.
So I came back to Jesus, like Jesus kind of came and got me. I was 36 and I was in my second marriage. I had 4 kids and I was an absolute mess, like truly a disaster. Depressed, not functioning well, super selfish, just really like a shell almost. Didn't have any depth I looked nothing like how God would have me be. And I just found myself like really hurting and depressed and didn't quite know what to do. Ended up going to a women's retreat, which was something I thought I would never do. I despised women's retreats at the time. Like I thought it was the most awful thing. But I just went, and it was this like Holy Spirit moment where, I mean, literally the whole entire weekend, I just felt like there was something going on inside of me. And I had grown up in my family was Christian. I'd grown up in the church, left the church at about the age 13 when my parents got divorced, and that's a whole thing. But, had been just really wayward, like rebellious and just kind of on my own from 13 to 36. And so I'd made a lot of choices that weren't good for me. And so there were a lot of consequences there. So that was sort of the culmination of that, like that moment when I was just like, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm just exhausted. And so during that retreat, God was just tickling me, like just, hey, like I'm over here. And I just felt like every word that came out of the speaker's mouth was directed at me, every word that was like the worship, and I was just weeping. And so ended up taking some time to sit in my hotel room and just decided to invite God back, because I knew he was there. Like my whole experience with God has been, I've always believed he's real. I've always known he's there. The Holy Spirit has been inside me since I was like 5. I just shut it down and stopped listening. And so I didn't have any problem with thinking that God was there. I just didn't know how to get to him. And that was kind of what I was telling it. It was just like, God, I'm so sorry. I know that nothing in my life is how you would want it to be. And I'm exhausted and I don't know what to do and I don't know how to get to you. And I'll just never forget that moment where I didn't hear the audible voice, but I just felt the presence of Jesus, literally Jesus, like at my shoulder, and the peace that washed over me. And I just heard in my mind him saying to me, like, child, I've been with you every step of the way. I know everything that you've done. I know everything that's been done to you. And you don't have to get to me. You just have to stop running. So turn around. And in that moment in my mind, I just turned around and I just kind of fell into his arms, and it was like nothing I've ever felt. And it was that moment that my capacity for denial was done, and I couldn't pretend like it didn't happen. And so that had been sort of my MO, like, it didn't happen, we're fine, it's okay, everybody's good. And it was in that moment where I was like, no, this is real. And so I went home to a really dysfunctional family unit and said, hey, I found Jesus, everyone. And that just started a whole new trend of a whole new path.
Were you still married at that time?
I was, yes. And so that was sort of my first understanding of, not quite yet. So that was just sort of the like, hey, everything has to change. And, you know, at that time, my oldest daughter was, I want to say she was like 16 or 17. And like, she had never been to church except for like Easter and Christmas. I had, you know, my youngest was maybe second grade. And so I just kind of jumped into, what's funny is at that moment, I just sort of shifted behaviors. So it was like, okay, I'm going to stop, you know, partying, drinking, all of the crazy kind of like ways that I've numbed myself from the pain, and just shifted it to like, okay, I'll volunteer at church, I'll be a leader here. And so I never really dealt with any of the pain at that point. It just was like, oh, I'll just stop doing bad things and do good things, which worked for a little bit, but not for very long. And so what sort of happened was I went through a really legalistic phase at that point. Like I was like, okay, this is who God wants me to be. Excuse me. And he doesn't want me to be legalistic in any way. And so I wasn't actually free. I was repentant and remorseful and had decided to make better choices, but I wasn't actually free. And so I started going to church, and I joined a women's group, which was also not my thing at all. I'm not against women. It just was this like, it wasn't my style. And so but these ladies were amazing. It was interesting. I walked in the door. I remember getting home from the retreat, and literally the first thing I did was text my grandma. And I was like, because I know she's been praying for me for so long. And I remember just texting her and being like, Grandma, like, it's good. Like, I all the prayers that you've had, like, I'm here. I'm back to Jesus. And I remember the first moment, like, walking in the door and being like, okay, it's Sunday afternoon. I need to find a group that meets on Monday. Like, that was my only criteria for this church. And it wasn't this church. And walked into this group of women, and they were all like, I was 36 at the time, and they were like, you know, I think the youngest was like in her late 40s, and there was like 50s and 60s. I remember walking in and being like, this is not for me. Like, these are not my people. Like, I have young kids. These are old ladies. And I was literally just like, okay, I'm gonna get through the night. That's it. And no, they were like exactly what I needed. The wisdom that they had, the life experience that they had. So they really walked me through a hard season. And so that was my life for about 4 or 5 years. Just kind of diving, and I like dove into the Bible, did every Bible study that I could ever get my hands on. Like Beth Moore, I was like a fanatic. I'm like, give me more, give me more. And so it was sort of after one of her studies, it was the Breaking Free study, where I realized, oh, I'm in an abusive relationship. And I didn't know, because I was so used to it. It was just the thing, like, hey, this is how we live. And so the minute that I realized it, I like actually realized it, was a kind of another moment of like, I can't deny this any longer. Like, it's true, and I don't know what to do about it, but it's true. And that was sort of my journey to separation, counseling, and then ultimately divorce. And I was involved in the church from that moment on.
So I think the cool thing about God is the way that he meets us in a very intentional way for the moment that we're at. Mm-hmm. And in your transition from the relationship that you were in and the hurt that you were feeling, you needed something solid to hold on to, which is why you probably locked on to the legalistic part of it. But then God, as he started to soften you and connect with you, he really released that and really got into the softer part of Jenn, who is the Jenn that I know now today. And when I was getting ready to talk with you today, I did some research, and there are approximately 9.9 million single moms in America today. So your story is not unique just to you. Your story is spread out in every city, in every neighborhood across the United States. Yeah. And it sounds like for you, it was a process. It was a process of letting go of a marriage that you were holding on to. What advice would you have for that mom who's in that stage, who's in that discovery phase of I know this marriage isn't working. Yeah. I've done all I can do. What advice would you have for a mom in that?
I mean, my advice would be to get deep into the word, to get deep into community, to like not do it alone at all. It's unfortunate. I think, I come from a divorced home. And so like when I was 13, my parents got divorced, and that was like in the 80s, like 83 or whatever. And like, I just remember my mom, it was this huge like stigma. Like she literally like left the church because, and this is like an evangelical church, not like a Catholic church. It was like hey, evangelical church. And there was a lot to it. Like there was a lot more to it than that. But like she literally felt so scorned and so like not welcome that she just left. And for me, I was really struggling with the fact of getting divorced because, my first, I got married when I was 18. I was pregnant and I didn't think I had any options. And so that marriage was, and I wasn't a follower of Jesus at all. And so that marriage was definitely doomed. Like we got to 4 years in, it was like, this is tragic. And so I didn't really care. That sounds so callous, but I didn't care. It was like, it didn't matter to me. Like this wasn't working. I'm done. A very worldly view of divorce. Like, hey, this isn't good. But my second marriage, like, again, I had made the choice to get married, not being a believer, not being someone that mattered. And I chose someone who was an awful choice. Like, it was a terrible decision. And awesome, because I have my kids. But when I came back to Jesus, I was like, I can't get divorced. Like, no way. I'm reading the Bible. I believe it's true. Like, God says he hates divorce. And it was so, and I was working at a church. Not this church. Disclaimer. But I couldn't fathom that I could do that. And so I really struggled because, every person that I went to was like, yeah, you can't get divorced. Like, no way. And for me too, it was this whole revealing of like, I'm in an abusive relationship. What does that mean? How do I share that? How do I let people into that story? Because I tried to hide it for so long and tried to pretend like everything was okay for so long that the opening of that door was really scary. And so I just I would love to encourage anyone who's dealing with that like there is help, and it is super scary and it takes so much courage. I remember literally saying things like, getting up the courage to be like, I won't be talked to like that way, and then would stand there for like 30 minutes and like be talked to that way, and then the next time it would be 20 minutes, and then the next time it would be 10. And so it was very slow, very gradual. I mean, literally, this was 2010 when I had this realization. I didn't get divorced until 2014. So I spent several years trying to, be separated and doing it that way. And I remember going to, honestly, 5 different people who I knew loved the Lord, believed the Bible to be true, were active in the church. And I was like, can you fast and pray for this amount of time and just like see what you get? Like, not even saying like, hey, can I get divorced? But like, just like they knew my situation. And I did the same. And I just, 3 of them came back with the exact same Bible verse. And I should remember where it is. But it was like, basically, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go and suffer no more, be free, paraphrase. And so I remember just sitting with God and being like, I don't know if this is right, because I didn't have the like biblical grounds. Like, my husband hadn't cheated on me, but there were so many people in the church that were like, if he's not hitting you, you have to stay. And it was like, that wasn't my abuse. My abuse was emotional. My abuse was verbal. And it was some physical in that, there was a lot of like destruction of property and blocking of doors and things like that. But abuse is such a confusing thing. And I think the enemy does such a good job of just wrecking you and being like, no, I'm fine. It's normal. So I think it just takes a lot of courage, and it's definitely not something that you can do alone. But, God, I do firmly believe that the church is going a direction of supporting women to like, hey, you don't have to stay in this. Like, God did not call you to survive. He called you to thrive and have an abundant life of joy. And so it's a hard decision to walk away from a marriage, but there is always forgiveness from God. It's not the like one thing that he's not going to forgive me for. And, ultimately, it was a decision that I made because my ex-husband, he didn't want to get healthy. He didn't want Jesus. He wanted nothing to do with it. And so there was no point in staying. I honestly felt like God at one point kind of said to me, you're in the way. Like he's not going to get anywhere as long as you stick around. And so again, honestly, it was mostly just me getting right with God personally. Like I just said, God, this is what I think you're releasing me from my marriage. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't agree with that, and that's okay, because it was my personal work with God to get there. And so I would just encourage anyone who's struggling with for whatever reason, like nobody wants to get divorced. They just don't. I mean, and it is hard, and it's brutal, and it's hard on your kids, and it's hard on your family, and it's a terrible thing, and that's why God hates it, because of what it does to family, but not because it's not the one thing that you have to just say, oh, God hates it, so I'm not going to do it. So I would just encourage people to be honest and to get support and loving, kind, real support.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you went to your people. You went to your tribe, your village, which we've said a lot on this show, that in the midst of those trials, in the midst of the confusion you might have had, you went to those people and you asked them to support, love, and care for you, which is something that I think is so huge and something that is so helpful for everyone to hear. And I know that you mentioned that this is something that was hard on your kids. Mm-hmm. I would love to hear a little bit more about like how that process was for them. I know technically it was twice for you. I just want to hear like how that was for them. How was it for you as a mother, kind of being that single mom in those phases as well? Like how did that relationship grow?
Yeah, it was really hard on my kids. I mean, they, my two oldest, they were young. They were like 6 and 3. And so that was really hard, very confusing for them. They didn't really understand. And it wasn't an amicable thing at all. Like it was brutal. And so they went through a lot because there was fighting, there was, and again, this was a very immature whole situation. Like you're literally dealing with like kids, basically, kids being parents. And it was hard. It was really hard. And they suffered a lot. And they have a lot of consequences of that today still. We have all, we're all connected. Like there's been a lot of grace and mercy. My kids have forgiven me for a lot of stuff that was really hard on them. And so that's really good. And I'm grateful for that. But they really dove into other families to be supportive. There are people that came alongside my kids, which I'm so grateful for. I mean, I have literally 3 or 4 different families that just committed to being there for my kids, even before I was a Christian. And they were all, basically Christians who are like, we see what's happening, we're going to make a step in. And then the second time around was actually a lot more brutal, because it was for my older kids, they not only had to deal with the loss of their dad, then they had a stepdad, and it was not good. Like there was not a lot of good there, some good. I don't want to paint it all bad. But it was hard. And so for them, and they were actually older, they were I want to say 18 and maybe 20 at the time, 21. But then the younger kids, who actually was their dad, they were 12, 13, and maybe 14, and it was brutal. And again, not always amicable. And there was a lot of drama and a lot of pain and yelling and not caring for the kids well. And they had to kind of get their love and support outside of me, outside of their dad. And fortunately for the, my 2 youngest ones, they did have a really good church community. Both were involved in a youth group. I mean, my son's high school pastor, I think really, walked him through everything. He was there for him, which was so important. And, but yeah, it's damaging. I mean, it is damaging to kids, but, there's hope. There's hope always in Jesus. There's hope for them to, heal from those wounds and to then, have more empathy, have more compassion. So that's kind of where they were.
Well, I appreciate the honesty and all of that. And you and I were talking earlier about how I also was a product of a divorced family. And there were 5 of us, 5 kids in my family, and I was the youngest. And my parents got divorced when I was 5. Mm. And unfortunately, it's probably one of my earliest memories, having my biological dad come and tell me that they were going to get divorced. And I remember being so sad because I was young enough to not have experienced all of the argumentation between my parents or how that trickled down. I just remembered being super happy and at peace and enjoying having all these other older siblings who took care of me. And really what happened when my parents got divorced was a complete fracture of our family. My biological dad popped in and out for a couple of years after they got divorced, and then I just didn't see him again. He would call occasionally in my 20s, and I did have a chance to reconnect with him. But for me, that was a really hard period of time because I went from, in my mind, this like idyllic family where I was well cared for. We were really super involved in our church at the time. And when my parents got divorced, my mom packed us all up into her, at that point, I think it was that station wagon that has the kids that can face backwards. She packed us all into that car, and we moved from a house that I had lived in my whole life into a tiny 3-bedroom apartment with my mom and all of us kids. And life just went upside down. And I feel super blessed that we were able to grow out of that. But we didn't have the sense of community that you had. For my mom, her church and her friends at church were her main community. And when she walked away from the marriage, she not only walked away from the marriage, but she walked away from a life that she had known before. And a lot of us in my family, the kids especially, have spent a lot of time wrestling with God and wrestling with our faith after that, because I know for the older siblings who were probably 16 and 14 at the time, to be exercised from like their church community as well as the lifestyle that they had known before was really hard. And so I would like to find out how we as a church can do better to come around single moms to, and I get it, it's hard as a church community when you're with a family and they're intact, you're loving the family as a family unit. And then when the divorce happens, it's like, whose side do you choose? Do you wrap around the husband? Do you wrap around the wife? How do you wrap around both? Yeah. And I know that's a hard question, but is there anything you feel like the church could do better to meet the needs of those families?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I know that the heart of the church is to meet the needs. I think we miss it a lot. Mm-hmm. I think that my own personal experience of the church was that I felt really judged. I felt really unsupported. Again, not this church. But it like, because my situation was, you don't have quote unquote biblical grounds, I just felt like I had a lot of people that didn't understand that I was making choices for my good and for the good of my kids. I think I felt really like people were just like, oh, you just didn't want to be married anymore. And I think for a lot of people, that is their experience. That it's just, no one, I won't say no one, but it's hard to understand, that you could make a choice to step out of something and to understand the why of it. I mean, for me personally, when I chose to get divorced, I lost a lot. My kids lost a lot. I mean, we like you, we moved, they had to move out of their home that they had grown up in, that they loved. That was all of their kids, friends, that was their life, and they had to move. And, again, fortunately, most of my, 3 of my kids were out, one went to college. So it was not a super long thing. It ended up being just my daughter and I living in a little tiny apartment, but that was different too. And, I took a big hit financially. I hadn't worked when I was married as much, and then I had to start working full time. And, I didn't make it. And so there was credit card debt, and those are just the realities of being a single parent, I think. And, especially as women, we typically tend to make less, and it's hard. And so, I think the church could really try and understand more. I mean, I think that, I remember one time, and this was literally, I left an abusive marriage. And I remember one time someone saying to me, because I was just talking about how, this is hard. I don't have enough money. I'm not, I'm going into debt. I don't, I'm needing more. And he just said to me, well, choices have consequences. And I don't think he meant it as brutal as I took it, But I was just like, yeah, they do. And I thought, I made a choice to leave a bad situation, and there are consequences, and a lot of really good happened from that. But a lot of really hard, bad things did happen from that. And I just felt so misunderstood that someone would say to me so casually or flippantly, like, yeah, your choice to get divorced. I mean, obviously that impacts your finances. And so I know that's not everyone's attitude, and I genuinely don't think that person meant that. But I think that the church just sort of misses it. Not that oftentimes we will be able to help and support, but I think what lacks is kind of the empathy and the compassion and the understanding of the why. Like, we didn't choose this for ourselves. Like, we might have made some bad choices, and then this is how it played out, but we didn't choose. No one chooses this. And I think really honestly, gratefully, thankfully, the church as a whole has stopped making divorce such a taboo thing where it's so terrible. And again, not to just accept it as oh, it's no big deal. It is tragic and it is devastating. But for the church to come in and say, we care for you. We care for your children. We want the best for you. What are your needs? What are your physical needs? What are your emotional needs? What are your spiritual needs? How can we come alongside you? And, I think for families to take in, and that's the other thing, we're still families. Single moms, single dads, we're families. And oftentimes we don't get included in the family. And that's hurtful. That's really hurtful. So I think we're on a good path, but it is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's always, for sure, grace when it comes to the church in these kind of situations, because it's hard to figure out for sure how to really go about it. But one thing I'm hearing you say, and I think this is something I'm taking away, is ask more questions.
Yeah.
Just ask more questions. What do you need? How can we help? What can we do to make this a little bit easier for your kids, for you? And it sounds like just that's a great way of surrounding. You might not have to have all the answers, but the questions are so helpful. And I think that's something that we can learn from these kind of scenarios of, hey, how can we make sure that these families are at least staying intact in the church? How do we keep these families from feeling like they're alone and rejected? Because I've seen it time and time again of families who have a break-in point, and they kind of either run away because they're afraid of what the church might think. Rather, if we come and step in and say, hey, we're here to support you. We know that this is difficult. We know that this is hard. And a lot of the times, most people at the church don't know what's happening exactly. And so I think, and you don't need to know. You don't need to know. It's not necessarily our job to know those things, but it is our job to love. The Bible says in John 13:34, love one another, just as God loved us. And so I think that's something that we have to consistently think about. And we've talked about it in a few podcasts of we have to reflect God's love to others. And so I think that's one thing that's going to help a lot of families in today's age of just knowing that you have a church that's right there to support you, love for you, care for you, without even knowing the details or the specific details. And so again, I'm thankful for you for sharing all of these things and being vulnerable with us and being able to give a little bit of insight on that side. I
think that's a great point, is to ask questions, be curious, not judgmental, or whatever that saying is. But that is really helpful, because I know for me, I was 13 when my parents got divorced, and we had to leave the church. My dad was actually a pastor, and so he was actually asked to leave. My mom never wanted to go back there because she felt so, shamed. And for me, that was my whole, that was all of my social life. That was everything about my world. And, I had a couple people that would reach out to me, but no, and I probably wouldn't have listened, but no one really committed to walking with me from the church. And I was involved. We were involved. And I don't know if that would have made a difference, but it might have. It might have changed the trajectory of my life, because I saw it happen with my boys. I saw when I got divorced, I saw the two men who had poured most into both of my boys stay, be there, be consistent, be safe, and be present. And they were there to ask the questions. And it made all of the difference in the world for them.
Yeah, I've had a few moments in my ministry years of just being there for some of my guys, of not necessarily even talking, just sitting there playing basketball or going just take a walk on the beach. And you see it time and time again. They just need that community. They need that connection, whether words are being said or not. And so I think that's something that's so important for the church to be able to be a part of these kids' lives, the parents' lives, and surround them. And I do think that question of like, what do we do in the scenario of like the husband and wife are divorcing, like who do we surround? And I do think no matter who's wrong or right in the scenario, you still love on both.
Yeah, it's both.
Yeah, you
it's
love on both. But like you said, they're still a family. A single mom with her kids is a family. A single dad with his kids are still a family. So we love the families because God loves them no matter what. Even if there is sin involved or anything like that, God still loves his people.
One of the things, Jen, you and I have talked about is we're in a period of time in our history, in American history, where it's time to shake things up a little bit. And we talked about how Jesus was the perfect example of that. And man, he just came in and he shook things up in such a gentle and loving way. I think sometimes when we say the words shake things up, we think it has to be with protests and signs and banging down doors. And I really think that when it comes to this issue and shaking things up a little bit, it's single moms or single dads gently tapping on people and being like, hey, here's my story, here's my experience. And I, as much as I want the church to wrap around single parents, I also want single parents to wrap themselves around the church. And to shake things up in that way. And I know you and I have talked about that, and we're both super passionate about that. And Father's Day has just come and gone by the time this episode will air. And I know that can be a hard time for single parents. Any advice you have for a single mom who's just experienced that, who's in that I'm ready to shake things up a little bit phase?
I don't know.
It's a big question.
Yeah,
I get
a big
it.
Question. I mean, I think just being intentional and honest and there specifically for moms, like with their kids, because Father's Day, Mother's Day, when you're a divorced family, those are both hard days. And, the kids are with one. If it's Father's Day, they're with their dad. If it's Mother's Day, they're with their mom. And so, that leaves one parent lonely. That leaves one parent thinking what it used to be. And that leaves kids feeling like stressed or anxious or, disloyal. And so I think for, Father's Day just passing, I think my advice to moms would be talk to your kids, ask them, like, how do you feel? To really create an environment where they can be safe to share, that their feelings matter, that their thoughts matter. And then I would think the same for dads, like talk to your kids. What's going on? How are you feeling? How can I love you? And I think really just, and obviously age appropriate, of course, but I think just owning, your part. I think to shake things up is to kind of like own your part and not be stuck in guilt and shame, not be stuck in denial, but just understanding the grace, understanding the mercy, and then sharing that with your family and your kids. And then, shaking it up, just love. It was really hard for me to get to a place to forgive my ex-husband. And I remember specifically there was a season where my youngest daughter was going away to college and we were going to be together. And it was like this, it was a couple years after, but it was a super intense time. It was a bad time. And I just thought, I can't go. And I'm going to ruin her time because we're going to end up standing in this dorm room and screaming at each other. And I remember just thinking, God, how do I do this? And he was like, love your enemies. And I kept thinking, but he's not my enemy. And God was like, he is. He's not your enemy, flesh, it's not the flesh and blood, it's the, spirits and all that stuff. But what I was feeling was you're hurting my children, therefore you're my enemy. And so the minute that I named him my enemy, just in my own mind, I wasn't standing there screaming at him, but in my own mind, I was like, okay, he's my enemy right now. That's how I feel. So when I admit that, and then I'm like, okay, God, help me love him. And honestly, and I'm not lying, the peace that happened in my heart, I was able to be genuinely kind genuinely considerate, genuinely, authentically present. And it was like, it didn't change any of the past, but it made the moment better. And so I think it's hard to forgive, but that's a way to shake things up, is to forgive and get yourself to a place where you can. Doesn't mean that you weren't wronged, obviously. It doesn't mean that, that person doesn't deserve whatever. I mean, and for all of us, like me too. But, forgiveness it does such a wonder in your own heart. And then that really helps your kids see, like, okay, I can do this too.
Yeah.
I think that's so good of just, I know this is a constant thing we've said multiple times, but asking those questions in a time such as Father's Day and Mother's Day. And I think the biggest part I even took away from that is listen to your kids. Allow them to feel in those moments of going back and forth, because the biggest thing even our first season we talked about is sometimes we project our feelings onto a situation, or we project our advice, and we try to make sure they live the right way, rather than just listening and having open and honest conversations with the kids, and allow them to feel and feel their own way without you interjecting at all. And so I think that's such good advice. And then that piece about forgiveness, I think it's so hard, no matter what, in today's society, to just forgive people. We always want to fight, right? Even today, like, we always want to fight something. We want to stand against or for something. And sometimes we allow that to cloud our judgment, especially in personal matters, where we just want to fight against that person, or we want to fight against what they're saying. And then sometimes, again, that going back to that listening portion of, we need to listen, we need to be willing to forgive, we need to be willing to fight for what's right rather than fight against somebody. And so I think that's so important for us to just continue to, like, go into a conversation without being ready to fight against your enemy or anything like that, but being willing to listen and forgive.
Yeah. And that note on listening too with your kids, I mean, something that I've really only just learned recently, which is sort of tragic, is to not just listen to their words, but to listen to the, like, emotion behind it. Because their words could be, like, either explosive or, not honest. But when you kind of learn to listen to their heart and their emotions, like, are they feeling angry? Are they feeling fear? Like, what, hopeless? Like, but to hear the heart behind the words is really the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, and looking at their body language as they're talking, because sometimes, like you said, they'll say something, but their body or their emotions are telling you something completely different.
And I super love the forgiveness piece. And I think that is such a beautiful way to shake things up, because I'm 40 years beyond the divorce of my parents. And as you were saying that, I'm like, I don't know if I've really forgiven my dad for piecing out and walking out on us. I mean, I won't even say dad without throwing a biological in front of it, right? I'm only gonna give him credit for giving me life, really. And that for me was really convicting, because that shows me that there's a lot of forgiveness that I need to do there, and forgiveness for him, but also forgiveness for my own heart and for moving forward. So I love that. And I love the idea of having grace for yourself in the place of life that you're at. I think a lot of times parents in general, but single parents especially, can feel really guilty and put a lot of pressure on themselves, because, one, you're dealing with the loss of a love, you're dealing with the loss of a marriage, and in some instances now you're the main breadwinner, and you're going back to work, and you feel like you're not there enough for your kids. So I think grace is a big part of the forgiveness piece too, and having grace for yourself. So thank you so much, Jenn, for dropping that knowledge bomb with us. We super appreciate it.
Lord.
Yeah.
We're super blessed to have you, and we're so thankful that you could come on today and just share and be vulnerable with us, with our listeners. And we're, like, so excited for this to drop right after Father's Day. And I think it's going to be so helpful for single parents, or just families with, like, blended families in that kind of case as well. So,
well, thanks for having me. I think it's really great that the church as a whole, but this church specifically, is really willing to start asking the questions, because that if we don't ask, we don't know. And we can't just keep on pretending like everything's fine. And so I'm super grateful that this happened, so that people can just know, like, there's so many different stories out there, and each story matters. It's good that this church is doing that.
Thanks, Jen.
No, thanks.
In our next episode, we'll be meeting with Tara Matson, who is working in ministry, but she's also a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she's created a course to help moms raise confident daughters. It's a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to sharing that story with you guys as well. Until then, know that we love you, we're praying for you, and we're walking beside you and your family in love.